Welcome to a more conceptual video than I normally do, but perhaps this could be a series if you're interested in such things. In today's video, I want to talk about the aspects of a good VGC team, because a lot of good VGC teams tend to share specific attributes, and I kind of want to break down a little bit of that. This is more general information that is applicable to just about any VGC format you can think of, which is the competitive doubles format for Pokemon. And while I won't get into too much meta specifics, I will kind of be basing this around Scarlet and Violet's meta, which currently is in Regulation C. Regulation D is about to come out pretty soon though. And this will not cover every possible option available, but this is a way to get you started. If you want to make a good VGC team, this is kind of some things you can keep in mind to make it a little easier for you to develop it. And the first thing is what makes a team good in VGC is that of consistency. So you're going to want a team that handles a wide variety of scenarios and can handle itself even in bad matchups or bad situations. Because there are so many options in VGC, you need to be able to cover a good bit of them, and even the ones that you're not specifically planning for, your team needs to be consistent enough that you can handle those reasonably well, even if you're not sure what those fringe options actually are, because there's just too many to keep up with, really. But how do we get from no team to a consistent team? And that is really going to be the focus of today's video. And I think the best place to start is looking at the format's current meta. So whatever VGC format you're currently playing in or wanting to play in, understanding the meta and the essence of what's popular, what's effective, what are most people running, how are most popular Pokemon built, what's their items, moves, so on and so forth. That's the first place to look, because this will give you an understanding of what is working as well as what isn't working. And you can go to Pikalytics for stats on all that stuff, or you can just play in the format or watch VGC tournaments and see what's being commonly used there, see what's winning, what's losing, all that good stuff. And with all of that, you'll start to pick up on patterns of common team cores and the different ways that Pokemon are built depending on the team that they're in. For example, Fluttermane may normally be a choice specs variety in this format, but if you see one that's in a team with, say, Gothitelle, there's a good chance it is going to be a Perish Song variety. And as you gain matchup knowledge and understanding of the format, you'll begin to pick out in Team Preview the likelihood of the builds that you're going to be running across. And understanding all of that, which it just takes time to figure it out, trial and error, or just studying the format essentially, you'll begin to see what it is that you can and cannot get away with in the format. Just because there are a nearly infinite amount of options, especially in Scarlet and Violet with the Terastallized gimmick, having all of those available options doesn't mean that you can get away with a lot of them. And understanding your meta is going to help you figure out what actually is something you can get away with. That being said, there is still a place for suboptimal options that I would label as off-meta or fringe options. Because while consistency is essential in VGC, unless you are one of the best players in the world, this next concept becomes more helpful the lower level you are as a player. And that is the surprise factor of suboptimal options. It's something I try to bake into all of my teams because I'm not good enough to get away with a very consistent team that is only consistent good meta options. Having something that is unexpected or even just difficult to plan for is very helpful and can sometimes net you wins that you otherwise would not be able to do, because a top level consistent team requires top level consistent play to actually get the full use of it. And I've made a video about this a couple months ago, but having that option that is very difficult to plan for can really hurt somebody's matchup into your team. And even in a best of 3 open team sheet format, it's still something that can really throw people off. My favorite example of this is a Water Terra Life Orb Dondozo that is a mixed attacker, so it has Wave Crash and Surf with Pelipper in the team. Dondozos are not built like that at all. None of them are. And if your answer for Dondozo is Intimidate stalling with Will-O-Wisp, you are going to lose to that Dondozo if that is your team's consistent answer to regular Dondozos. So obviously a top level player can outplay your weird option Surf Dondozo, but anybody below a top level player might have some serious issues with that, especially on the ranked ladder where you don't actually know what your opponent's team is and you just get blindsided by a Surf, Water, Terra, Dondozo, and Rain, and your Arcanine can get 2 hit through a defensive Terra by that Surf. That's where the viability of suboptimal options become incredibly relevant. So it's definitely something that an average player is gonna want to consider when making a good VGC team, because it's easier to work with having a weird option present that you can use as an out that is so far removed from the statistics that it is not possible to plan for such a suboptimal option. But you can't make your whole team suboptimal options. That doesn't work. There's a balance to it. A balance between consistency and an inconsistent fringe option baked into the same team. So now that we talked about the inconsistent option, let's focus on the consistency part, because that is still the primary goal of making a good team. And I'm going to go over a few concepts to help you find that consistent team. So the Pokemon that you put in your team can't just be a list of your 6 favorite Pokemon that all have good moves and you just throw it out there and hope for the best. It doesn't work that way. Your team needs to synergize together. That's what team cores are about. So when you're building, say, a team core, which is typically 2 to 4 Pokemon, sometimes it's the entire team, but usually it's like 2 to 4 Pokemon that work very well together, and it's like your default option for most scenarios. That's kind of your team core. An example of that would be Dondozo, Tatsugiri. Those two are always together typically. And common team cores with that typically have, say, Glamora and Fluttermane in it, though Fluttermane's in every team right now. But it's a set of Pokemon that you almost always bring as just the default option. So you got the default lead and the default 2 in the back, typically. The other 2 Pokemon on your team essentially being counterpicks or options for bad matchups, or just a surprise out that is unpredictable. And a very basic example of what a good team core looks like is a Fire, Water, Grass core, which is very common in VGC. I know Palette Balance teams had this core in it. So you had Palafin as the water type, Arcanine was the fire type, and Amoonguss was the grass type. Those 3 typings cover a lot of options very well, and you typically have an answer for Dragon if you're running a Fire, Water, Grass team, which Fluttermane fits that role so well and allows the Fire, Water, Grass core to just work super well. So if you don't really know where to start, that is a great place to start. Just get you a good fire type, a good water type, and a good grass type, and you can kind of fill out the rest based on those. But the reason that core is so effective is because of its typing coverage is actually pretty good and easy to work with. But if you want to check out like your full team's typing coverage, there are resources online for that. I think Picolytics has that, and there's probably some others too that I'm not thinking of. You can look around online and see what you like best for that. But having good type coverage in your team, both offensively and defensively, is essential. Defensively, good coverage allows you to set up scenarios for free or low damage switch-ins, because the Pokemon in the back is going to have such different weaknesses than the Pokemon that you're switching out, which is why immunities are so great to work with too. And offensively, it is more efficient to have stab offense versus just running a AV Pokemon with 4 coverage moves, and none of them are stab. And when you're setting up that typing coverage, you also need to set up your Pokemon's roles. Not every Pokemon needs to be built for every possible situation. Typically, you have offensive Pokemon and supportive/defensive Pokemon in your team, and they are separate roles. You don't run an offensive Amoonguss with 252 special attack, so you can have it as an offensive option while also running 3 support moves. Hybrid offensive-defensive Pokemon like that don't actually work that well. Unless it's your off-meta option, you really should not have a team full of Pokemon like that. It's better to have Pokemon specialized where you just have very offensive Palafin. That's what it does. It does the offense. Even though a lot of those were built to answer Dondozo as well, it was still primarily an offensive Pokemon. Now, some Pokemon are offensive supports where they do actually have supportive moves, but they also have decent amounts of coverage, but you primarily do not rely on those as your main sweeper because they don't put out enough offense to do that. Still, there are exceptions to all of that, but typically Pokemon are given a set role, and that's kind of just what they do. And I alluded to counter picks earlier, where you want to have Pokemon that answer your team's bad matchups. I will explain how to figure out your team's bad matchups in a minute. But having one or two Pokemon that answer bad matchups helps with the consistency of your team. And one last part of making a good team core for your team is switch out utility. Cycling out Pokemon, whether through straight up switching it out or using a move like Volt Switch or U-Turn, most good VGC teams get a ton of utility out of switch outs. That's why you'll see Intimidate and Regenerator or weather setting and terrain setting abilities being so prevalent in VGC, as well as Choice Lock being quite common, and even some items that activate on switching. Switching in and out Pokemon is very essential for setting up your team to be in a favorable position. So having a lot of utility out of switch outs is a big function of VGC, and you are going to want some form of that in your team. Some teams even have the entire team benefiting from switching out, and that tends to work quite well. Even if it's just a Pokemon having access to Fake Out, it still synergizes very well with switching out consistently during a battle. So those are just different pieces that you can put together into your team as a checklist if you want. And getting most of that will help you to have a team that is at least functional. But how does that team go from functional to usable in your format? And the best way that I have found to troubleshoot that is to play out scenarios against popular teams. Because ultimately, a very consistent team is going to have an answer for every popular option in your format. That is what makes a team consistent. What I mentioned earlier for a team core were tools to get there, but playing out these scenarios against popular leads and popular teams is going to help you optimize your team for the format and figure out what its actual weaknesses are. For example, if you predict a certain type of team is most likely to lead Fluttermane Chi-Yu on your team because it makes the most sense to lead those two options against your team. If your team does not have an answer for that lead, and you have not calculated an answer for that lead, every time that lead shows up, you're likely to struggle unless your opponent throws. So if your team does not have an answer for it, you're going to have to essentially workshop it to figure out, okay, how do I bake an answer into my team for that specific lead? What is the option that I'm going to do turn 1 or even turn 2 to beat that lead? And once you have an answer for every popular option in your meta, every popular lead, and every popular team, then you have the basics of a consistent and viable VGC team. That is essentially the proof that it works and that it is good. And there's a lot of different options out there that actually can do that most people don't use, because it takes a lot of time and trial and error to really figure that out. And you might even have to just sit there for a couple hours brainstorming what to do against popular options. But once you figure that out and have a way to play against every popular option, your team could have like a Sliggoo as a lead against a popular option. But if you know that it works against that lead, you're gonna get some surprise wins on people that just were not expecting to be beaten by a Sliggoo. Because once you figure out what is popular, what you can expect to come across, you can essentially read teams like a book in Team Preview, because 80% of teams that you're going to run across after Pokeball tier are going to be rental teams or based on rental teams. In other words, they're going to be very predictable. And figuring out how to position your team to have a favorable turn 1 or turn 2 against popular teams, it really doesn't matter what Pokemon you have in the team. as long as you've already calculated that it works in the end. So in a way, you can use whatever Pokemon you want, but the entire team may not be able to be whatever Pokemon you want. I hope that I explained that reasonably well so that you can at least understand part of it and help you better understand how to make a team for essentially any VGC format that you're currently playing. And if you want to see more videos that are kind of conceptual VGC stuff, then you can click the algorithm buttons to promote it if you wish. Or if you have any additional questions, I may or may not be able to answer, but you can let me know down in the comments below. Because I'm not the best player out there, but I do have some understanding of a few of the do's and don'ts of this game. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time.